1 second here. Can you see a slide presentation? Okay. Okay, so disclaimers. You probably don't have to be told of this, but I promise you it's often true. Attorneys are a pain in the tail. The involvement of attorneys in deals and startups can often kill them. However, you ignore us at your peril. There's all sorts of things that can happen. In fact, that's one of the purposes of this presentation. In a sense, I'm not going to teach you all the law. I don't know all the law. No one knows all the law. It's a big creature. However, there are a lot of amateur mistakes you can make. And hopefully, if you have awareness of different areas of the law that apply to small businesses, you can avoid some of these amateur mistakes and maybe save your company a lot of trouble. In fact, I brought a prop. So this is a gavel, judges use it. If you see one of these in real life, there's a good chance things have gone wrong because you don't want to be in court. You want to do everything outside of court if you can possibly avoid it. And there's a lot of preventative stuff they can do to keep you outside of court and keep you outside of disputes, or at least reduce those disputes. Likewise, this presentation does not constitute legal advice. No attorney-client relationship exists because of this video. I'm not representing my client, nothing personal. You probably don't want me representing you. I don't have a big fat malpractice insurance policy in case I screw up. You want to go to a lawyer that has a big fat malpractice insurance policy. I don't really want to do that sort of thing. So, however, I do represent, in some cases, small clients, but generally speaking, they won't be students at San Francisco State. But, maybe down the road, we can see. I don't know all the law. And it's important that law varies from place to place and from situation to situation. And not only that, but it changes over time. So I am sometimes wrong. And sometimes I say just the opposite of what I mean. So the accuracy of none of this information is guaranteed. And I'm more likely to make verbal mistakes than written mistakes because I can proofread what I write, but I can't proofread what I say until after the fact. And this presentation is only an introduction. It does not contain all the relevant law and even all the types of relevant law. And that's very important. There's so many things that can affect your business. Don't think you know everything. You can know a lot of the big things, but there's things that can creep up at you, and you need to kind of build an ongoing awareness of those sorts of things. Okay, so what we're going to cover is, I'm going to be a little bit theoretical, but mostly this is going to be nuts and bolts type of law. I'm going to introduce the structure of the U.S. legal system because you're going to need to know it for several things, even for small businesses. I'm going to build awareness of areas of law pertaining to small businesses. And remember, small businesses can go up to 500 employees or more. Small businesses aren't all that small a lot of the time, but some small businesses are very small, and they all start usually very small. I'm going to talk about the public policy considerations, because that's important to know. Some of the things to look out for and some strategies to help with those. And if you want to try out some legal concepts, there's going to be workshop sections of this where you actually get to try out things yourself. Okay, so purposes of the law. In the old days, like in merry old England, the Vikings came over from Norway and Denmark and essentially took over the whole population and said, you have to obey the law or I'll kill you. And the law wasn't for the benefit of anyone but like the king and maybe the people who took over. Now, law is still to maintain the survival of the sovereign, except that, we kicked out the king and queen of England, and so the people are the sovereign. So hopefully it's partly for self-maintenance, but it's more also for the good of the people. And that leads to a lot of laws to achieve social goals, including intellectual property law, by the way. And then a lot of it, and this is very important for small businesses, is to facilitate getting along with each other, both at a national, international level, but also individual people. For instance, if you're on a team in a startup, knowing the law and awareness of these things can help you get along with each other in the future, or at least hopefully the disputes won't be as painful. And there will be disputes for many of you. Okay, so there's a whole ethical thing. There's a law has ethics week, and when I took the MBA at SFSU in finance, one of my business classmates said, there are no ethics in business. So there's different points of view on that, different levels. So let's talk about some of this, because you hear about people on Wall Street getting away with all sorts of stuff, and there's stuff I feel is highly unethical, shouldn't be permitted, but it is permitted. So there's things that are illegal, and illegal things can get you fined or thrown in prison. So a bunch of you have heard about the FTX case where there was a billionaire, Freed Bankman, I believe his name is, and he did something really bad. Okay, one thing he did bad, and this is something that has gotten people into a lot of trouble, is he used money from his clients, and he took that money and then used it for his own purposes and did not tell the clients. So that's essentially taking someone else's funds. You have the funds legally, but using it for something that was not, and you can get in a lot of legal trouble. Whether it's ethical or not, you get big legal trouble. So don't do that. Then there's things that are socially unethical. For instance, you maybe make some statement that upsets a lot of people if people feel does not reflect their values. You can be canceled, but due to free speech in this country, you can't be actually thrown in jail for most of that. But it can still have big implications in your business. Every week we see headlines where some CEOs said something or done something that people feel is ethical, and so there's boycotts and there's all sorts of things like that. And then there's socially acceptable things that generally most people feel are not only legal, but they're socially acceptable, maybe even socially commendable. So you, as a business person, you're going to have to figure out how your personal ethics fits into this. Maybe things that are illegal don't bother you. You're willing to take the risk. You're risk adverse. You don't care if it's illegal or not, so you go do it. You know what I mean? Maybe you work for, well, we won't say who you work for, but you watch the gangster movies and see all sorts of things like that. But even in the social and ethical stuff, you're going to have to figure out what is acceptable to you and what isn't. And you should try to articulate this for yourself, especially if you're in a situation, if you feel a little bit queasy about it, or you feel a little bit uncertain about it, you should think these things through. You might even want to write up your rationale, or maybe not, depends. But the thing is, just be aware of this. So one of the first areas of law are contracts. So contracts exist, they're agreements between two or more parties. And some of you, when you begin your small business, you're going to be doing contracts right away. You probably already are involved in some contracts. Examples are website terms of service. Every time you click I agree, you're essentially agreeing to a contract. Now, how many of you read through those hundreds of pages before you click? No, and even some of the Supreme Court justices don't either. So you're hoping that if there's anything too bad in there, it won't get enforced. And there's some reason to believe that. It's not hard and fast, but usually for the big things, enough people call out the company if they're doing something too bad, or you just hope it won't get enforced. Now, leases, you probably, if you've signed a lease for a business premise or an apartment, that's a contract. Employment agreements are also contracts. Now, here's the thing. Business to business, including employment agreements, often these do get enforced. You should not just click I agree on a business agreement or anything you're doing for your business. You can give up a lot of rights and not even know you're giving up those rights. And you could have this great business concept, but if you haven't read your employment agreement or your contractor agreement, you might not own the concept of that. And you might not even know that you don't own the concept. You might do tons and tons of work on this and not even own it, not even know that you don't own it until it's too late. And that's a horrible thing to be into. So there's different types of contracts. There's verbal contracts, there's written contracts, there's implied contracts. For instance, when you go in the store and like Walgreens or something and take a candy bar and then put it on the counter and then they ring it up and you give them some money, you essentially, that's a sales contract. It's an implied contract. None of you have agreed on the terms, most likely. It's just because of behavior, or it's considered to be a contract, an implied contract. Now, if you go to somebody and say, I'll walk your dog for $20 per afternoon, and the other person says, fine, here's my dog, then that would be an example of a verbal contract. And then there's written contracts, and it's obvious what a written contract is. Usually those are written down, including the terms of service that you click on. Now, these have different degrees of enforceability, and there's a few things you have to think about here. Like for instance, in a verbal contract, how do you prove what you agreed upon verbally if you haven't recorded it somehow? So if it goes to court, it's your word against the other party's word. And you can get yourself, I mean, you may be thinking one thing, you may be thinking another. And even if you do prove what each other said, it can be pretty bad. So if it's really important, write it down. Okay, so what are the elements of contracts? So you want to state exactly who the parties are. And this is really important if you're doing business with somebody who's not shitty. Like this is very important in housing if you buy a house. So I used to work in title insurance also, where we would spend a lot of time making sure that the person who's selling the house is the actual owner of that house. I mean, if you go out buy $1 million house from somebody and you think they're the owner, they may even think they're the owner, but if they don't own it, you've just wasted $1 million. That's a lot of money, at least for most of us. So you want to do the research, make sure you know who you're agreeing with, make sure that that party has the right and the power to give you what they say they're going to give you in the contract. And then what will be given by each party, that's called consideration. You're not really allowed to have a contract where one person gives something and the other person just receives and doesn't give anything back. You can do it. People give donations all the time, but that's not really a contract and has limited enforceability. So another big thing is, say, for instance, that this applies to leases and it might apply to service contracts. When can the contract be changed? How can it be changed? Do changes have to be in writing? And that's often in a contract, whether they have to be in writing or not. And usually they do. And then how it can be terminated. Say you don't want to live there anymore. So when you sign like a housing lease, and a lot of this is governed by state law for housing leases, usually you can break the lease, but there's usually some pre-agreed penalty that you'll have to pay to get out of the lease. So you can have those, and you should have those in any type of contract that you have. Like for instance, if it's a service contract, you agree to give 2 weeks notice if you're providing the service, or if you're getting the service, maybe you want 2 weeks notice from the other person. And if they don't, what are the penalties? They forfeit some money or that sort of thing. Okay, so let's think about contracts a little bit. Let's do a little bit of a workshop part of this. So is anyone thinking or contemplating of a kind of a contract, either provide, say, computing services, consulting services? And what do you think should be in that contract? Again, nothing confidential, but
I would want the deliverables that I'm looking for the contractor to finish before I pay them.
okay, deliverables. So what you're going to get?
Yeah.
Compensation, I guess.
Exactly, and that's a big one. So what would be an example of compensation?
Like hourly rate or
Okay, and what would be another example of compensation?
Equity.
Equity, you're thinking in a startup mode, that's right. And okay, what would be another example? And some of your clients are going to want this as an example for real life.
I guess an invoice amount, remuneration.
Well, that's close, flat fee. They're going to want a flat fee. Like say you create this software app and they say, well, I'll pay you $5,000 for it. Whereas you're thinking, well, this thing might take a year and that's not very much money for a year's worth of work. But it's very important, and this is one reason you want in writing to specify whether it's going to be a per hour amount, and I guess maybe they'll want to cap the amount, the total hours, or maybe it's going to be certain hours per week, or maybe it's going to be a project with 500 hours and has to be done in the next 3 months. Not exactly, you don't say exactly when it has to be done, but by that time. And the equity is a big one. So I'm going to pick your brains over here. So what are some of the dangers of giving people equity in a contract, for a service contract, for instance? we'll get to this later, but think about things that can go wrong, because I know people who have done this and things have gone wrong, and it's kind of messy and unpleasant to clean that up. And sometimes you can't clean it up. Okay, so other things that you want in the contract are how to contact the parties. For instance, the names and addresses of the parties so that you know where to send them the invoice. That's not always good. I mean, you can send an invoice, and that doesn't mean they're going to pay the invoice. And sometimes it's good to know where they like to go for coffee or they like to go for food, and then you chase them down with a copy of your invoice to get them to pay up. And like they might pay, but the check doesn't necessarily always get signed. And that's where you sometimes have to go chase them down physically, get them to sign the check that they sent you. Collections is a really big problem. And a lot of big companies will say, for instance, if you pay on time, we'll give you a certain discount. So they try to give you a carrot instead of just a stick. And that's really important because in big contracts, a 2% discount, say it's a $100 million contract, that's $2 million. You know what I mean? That's very significant. And it might be a higher amount for smaller contracts. Okay, so think of the things that you might want to go in agreement. I'm going to jump in a little bit. So we actually covered a lot of these, but some of these are important. So there might be expenses. For instance, you might have to license software to create your app. Or if you're doing dog walking, maybe you have to get a whole thing of plastic bags, not that much, but still an incidental expense. And so who's going to be responsible for the incidental expenses? And then who will own the intellectual property that's generated? That's very important. For instance, if you're writing a book for somebody, they may want to own that book, the copyright to that book. Not only that, they might want to own all the copyrights you write in the future. So you have to negotiate that. And it can be negotiated many different ways. We talk about termination. So going back to levels of the law, there's several of these. Federal is the federal government. State is like the state of California, and there's 50 states and territories. County is the subunit under states. Cities are like San Francisco, asterisk. And we also have international law. Sometimes, even though international law is not written in our law, we still have to obey it. And then if you're doing business in other countries, and if you have a global website, you might be doing business in other countries, whether you think about it or not, you may be subject to their laws as well. So then there's branches of the US government. Each level tends to have its own branch. I'm just going to let you peek at these for a minute. So we have the Constitution. The US Constitution is kind of like the governing document for computer types. It's kind of like the overall operating system. And then everything exists within that. Even the state constitutions kind of exist within that. So you have legislatures, you have a Senate, and you have Congress at both the federal and the state level. Cities and counties have a little bit of this stuff. You have courts of law, which interpret the legislative law. Sorry, 1 second. And you have you have two types of law that you need to be aware of. One is you've probably heard of common law. Well, what is common law? Common law is the law that we inherited from merry old England. And in addition to that, we've been adding to it, but there's a lot of things that are parts of the common law, for instance, common law trademarks, that have never been passed by a legislature, but are still part of the law and they still count for something. And part of what makes this work is something called stare decisis. Are there any pre-law people lurking around here? None, okay. So stare decisis means that decisions, especially appellate court and Supreme Court decisions, affect future decisions, that future decisions are supposed to be consistent with decisions that have already been made at these higher levels. That's called stare decisis. So we have to look to the case law. In Europe, they don't go so much by case law. It's much more by the legislation, but here case law is very important. And then there's executive, the president, governors, they create regulations and policy. And in a case of the patent office or trademark office, they create a lot of the day-to-day sorts of things, executive branch. Okay, let's give an example of how this works for patent law. So actually, the power to create patents is provided in trademarks, not trademarks, patents and copyrights is provided by the US Constitution. It was there right from the beginning. So it said that Congress shall have the power to promote these things. Congress doesn't have to, but they are empowered by the Constitution to do that if they want to. So example would be federal legislation. The Congress wrote the United States Code, Title 35 on patents. Then the executive branch wrote regulations to kind of like be more specific and spell out the Title 35. And this is Title 37 Code of Federal Regulations. And then at the lower level, at more the agency level, there's a manual patent examining procedure. And that's like what patent agents and patent attorneys use on a day-to-day basis to figure out what the rules of thumb, and not rules of thumb, but how to actually do the patent, what the patent office is, what the procedures are. And then the courts interpret all this. Sometimes they'll say it's, something is illegal and they're not going to enforce it or they'll override laws. So you've got these levels and they all matter. I don't want to be overwhelming you, but once you get used to this, it'll make sense. So let's see, entity formation. I'm sorry, that jumped ahead a little bit. So choosing your entity type is, for instance, you form a business and entity type is typically a matter of state law. And so you have different types of entities. And if you're just doing business yourself, say you're walking your neighbor's dogs and you walk the dog, they give you the cash. That's about it. That's called sole proprietorship. And they're easy to set up. I mean, once you start taking cash or doing stuff, you are a sole proprietorship. You don't even need to register it necessarily. But you have personal liability. Say that you take someone's dog and it, I guess, bites, who was it? Taylor Swift, the famous musician, ruins her career. That's $10 billion down the drain, and they're going after, and the record companies are going after you for all that lost money. You are personally liable for it in a sole proprietorship. Likewise, in a partnership, not only are you, for just a basic partnership, not only are you liable for what you have done in terms of damages or debts, you're also liable for things that your business partners sign up for the business to. Like if your business partner signs a loan agreement for your business, you are liable for the amount of that loan, in addition to your partner being liable. Okay. C corporations, when you hear about corporations, they protect you from that personal liability if you do everything correctly. They can provide you from that. They're more expensive in paperwork. California requires like a minimum $800 fee for those, for the LLC and LLPs, by the way, which I should have mentioned. But when people talk about corporations, they usually mean C corporations. There's these things in between called LLCs, like limited liability companies, limited partnerships. And these can give you the tax benefits of a sole proprietorship or partnership. Say you lose a bunch of money, say you get hit with that $10 billion bill. Well, if you're a billionaire yourself, well, you can take that $10 billion off your taxes if it's a sole proprietorship, off of your personal income taxes. So that's a pretty good perk in some ways. And that sounds exaggerated, but there are many cases where you do have losses, particularly in real estate and that sort of thing, where you want to take the tax benefit of that loss. Whereas for a corporation, you cannot directly take that from your personal income taxes. LLCs, LLPs, and give you limited liability in many cases, personal liability, while giving you some of those tax advantages. An S corporation is an older way of doing this. It's a corporation, but it's a special IRS filing that allows easier tax write-offs. And there's a relatively new type of corporation called a benefits corporation. It has shareholders, but like a C corporation is supposed to be working for their shareholders, not for society. So if you like dump toxic waste in the California Bay, in the San Francisco Bay, and it allows you to make an extra $1, in a sense, you're legally, if it's not illegal, you're legally obligated to do that because it helps your shareholders make money. Your sole duty essentially is to your shareholders. Well, some people feel like that's not the way they want to do business. They would want to benefit society while making a return for their shareholders, and B corporations are a way to do that. They're corporations, but they often have special registration. And this, again, varies state by state. This is all state law. Now, another big issue for startup companies, not necessarily small businesses as much, but startup companies, is where to incorporate. It seems obvious you're in California, incorporate in California, but there's disadvantages, especially if you want investors, especially if you want venture capitalists. You're more likely to want to incorporate Delaware because they have more corporation-friendly law. A lot of investors know about Delaware corporations. So you may want to do that. Nevada is also going to be popular for some startups, for instance. There's kind of an intermediate state between California and Delaware, legally, not just geographically. And if you're into crypto and certain types of banking, I don't have personal experience with that, but I've heard that South Dakota is good for that sort of thing. Just gonna drink some water for a second.
Hey, Mark, when you get a chance, what's so great about Delaware? Like, can you give an example? Oh, I didn't mean to completely ruin your flow. Oh, you're on mute.
I said all the good stuff, but I can't repeat that. In the case of Delaware, the way they handle, for instance, stock has some advantages. For instance, some states will charge you a franchise fee based upon the stock. And so if you have like 10 million shares of stock and say there's a franchise fee of $1 per share annually, then that's $10 million right there. If you're not in California, if you're totally not in California, you can avoid some regulation and you don't have to pay the $800 California minimum tax for corporations and LLPs and stuff. Now, if you're a Delaware corporation, but your operations are in California, you still have to do a lot of the California paperwork. But a big part of Delaware is, and I don't know all the benefits of it, but the thing is, if you're getting bought and sold, for instance, and you may want to sell your company to somebody else, and they're a Delaware corporation, and you're a Delaware corporation, it just makes things a little more consistent. And a lot of the lawyers who do this type of work are specialized in Delaware law. So they know Delaware law. So it doesn't have to be re-explained. They don't have to learn a whole bunch of new cases and things like that. I haven't looked at this for a little while. If it's something you wanted me to get further into, I can do that. All I know is that California can be a pain and Delaware is good. Now, here's the problem. One situation, a tricky thing is it's really easy to incorporate. In fact, let me get into this. It's really easy to incorporate. It's really easy to incorporate in Delaware. Some places are harder, but California, Delaware, they're easy. It's not always easy to unincorporate. So doing these things, you kind of lock yourself into a lot of paperwork and you can unwind a corporation, but it's not always so simple and not straightforward. And there may be money involved. You may owe money involved and that sort of a thing. So don't just rush off to do this. Think about these things and kind of have all your ducks in a row before you do that. And you may wish to get an attorney who is both familiar with business formations, particularly corporations, and one who is familiar with those in your particular area of business. I can tell you that real estate business entities are much different than like software business entities. Not only that, but in software, okay, real estate, if you've ever looked at an organizational chart for real estate, they have so many entities involved for even relatively small projects because they want to make sure a certain party has a liability and other parties get certain tax benefits. And I've been involved with some of that. I'm not an expert in this by any means, but like, for instance, for one just small modest-sized subdivision, there were like about 20 or 30 different entities. And this weird maze and tangle of relationships between that. So software companies, bigger ones, also do that because they don't want to pay income tax at all if they can avoid it. So what do? You say, like, for instance, if someone clicks on an advertisement and generates, say, $1 for Google or something, well, could be $1 of taxable income. But if you pretend that it wasn't clicked here in California, but was clicked somewhere in the Bahamas, where they don't have any income tax on that, then you're getting tax-free revenue, right? And so there are complicated business structures that allow for that sort of thing as well. In fact, what was his name? Daniel Fernandez. He's spoken to the Finance Club at San Francisco State several times on this subject. So for some of you who are business majors, there's actually, you can work for these entities that set up all these complicated things for Silicon Valley and make a nice living off of it. Okay, Sybil, to answer your questions. Partly, okay. I have to be careful I don't talk too long on things. So what's involved in an initial business? So if you have a sole proprietorship, you could make an agreement with yourself, but that's not really going to do much good, although it's good to think about those things. But when you do partnerships, all those things that we talked about in a contract apply to partnership agreements for the most part. And you should think about all these sorts of things. And one of the biggest things, and this happens on teams, I've seen startup teams, is that once you get to a certain point, one partner either will want to leave or they will not be that motivated to do work. But yet they may still claim their full share of equity, for instance. And you want to, maybe in your partnership agreement, and then in your essential employment agreement with the corporation, say, like, for instance, if you're a founder and you're entitled to 10% of the stock, you have to work 5 years to get that stock, and so 2% of that's vested each year. That will be in these sorts of agreements, some of them. Like, for instance, a partner agreement, if you have a partnership before you incorporate, for instance. And this stuff should be talked about, not necessarily, well, actually, as early as you think you can. I mean, sometimes, you don't want to set up this business entity if you don't actually have a product yet, or don't even know what your product's going to be. But the earlier you can have these conversations and the understanding between each other, with the understanding that things may change between each other, the less pain you'll have in the future. So and the partnership agreement is a written agreement signed by both parties, and both parties should keep their own copy in case of things get lost. I think these actually can be registered with the county clerk in some cases, but you may not want that all out in the public. Maybe you want to keep this private. There's a good chance you do. So for corporations to incorporate, you file what's called articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. They will, for instance, talk about the duration of the corporation, which is often perpetual, the name of the corporation. They'll provide for holding annual meetings and things like that. There's also bylaws, which are more specific. And then for corporations, you have to file annual filings in addition with the Secretary of State, in addition to stuff for the IRS and the state government for taxes. So early examples of business things are trademark registrations and patent applications. You may often want to do these sorts of things before you incorporate, just so you can start pitching this to investors. There's a lot of investors in technology who don't even want to deal with your company unless you have a patent application. Okay, so, and then this is very important. Intellectual property agreements, all the founders, investors, employees, contractors, innovators. Who owns what, who has the rights to future research, for instance. This all should be written down, because say, for instance, if you don't have this written down and someone on your team creates something great, they may just take that product and walk away with it, and leaving the rest of you all out in the cold, regardless of how much work you put in. So do that early. That's really important. Likewise, and I'm going to probably talk about this again, read all of your employment agreements and things that you've signed when you've worked for other people. And we'll get into that, but you should definitely read that, because you don't want to be promising things you don't actually have to promise. So the local government has all sorts of things too. If you're using a fictitious business thing, like say your name's Gene Smith and you're doing business with name Gene Smith, that's fine, that's your name. But say it's like Gene Smith's Donut Company. Well, all of a sudden, Gene Smith's Donut Company isn't a person, that's a fictitious business name. You're doing business as that. So you often have to register that with whatever counties or cities that you're doing that in. And again, this is typically on a city or county basis. And if you're doing business in a whole bunch of cities and counties, you'll have to file this in maybe all of them. So like I said, states are usually composed of counties, And then there's cities within counties. San Francisco is a weird exception where San Francisco, the county is the city. They're kind of the same thing. There's different parts that do different things. Like there's a city hall on one hand, which is a kind of a city sort of thing. But then there's the, the Hall of Justice or something, which is more, I think that's the sheriff, which is more of a county sort of a thing, for instance. So it's called the City and County of San Francisco. Pretty much the rest of the entire remainder of the United States, not everywhere, but nearly everywhere, cities are part of counties. And permits also are required for particular types of businesses, especially at the local level. Like if you're opening a restaurant, they may want a permit for that sort of thing. If you're opening, like I say, a dental office, if you might be producing, if they think it's a bakery will produce lots of CO2, they might, or pollution, they might want a permit for that. Okay, so this is a really big topic so you're working with people, maybe you're working for a big company, maybe you're hiring people for your startup, or you don't want to hire people because once you get into employment, that's a whole bunch of paperwork and tax work, and it's a lot. It's surprising how much it can be. So you just want to make a deal, like say, will you do some design work for me for like say $35 an hour, and you'll be an independent contractor. So that's could be fine, but if you try to classify someone as an independent contractor, but the state really feels that they're an employee, then you may owe lots and lots of payroll taxes. And even if you're a corporation and your corporation doesn't have the money, if you get this wrong, you will probably be personally liable for unpaid payroll taxes. So what's the difference between an independent contractor and an employee? There's several different classification factors. They change depending on what law or court decision has happened, but there's some general ones. For instance, independence. Say if you're working at McDonald's, you probably have a big procedure manual. You're sitting at the counter, you're doing all your work at the McDonald's location. You might have a supervisor breathing down your neck. That's not independence. That's not control. Whoever owns that McDonald's, they have the control, and you have very little independence. So you're almost certainly an employee there. On the other hand, if you have your own equipment, your own software, and you're doing your own design work at home, not at the business, and you have a great amount of latitude how you do that, then you're more likely to be an independent contractor. So ownership of equipment, that's one thing. If you own it, the person who owns it is more likely to be a contractor if they're a small person doing services. If the big company owns that equipment, who's like bringing on the independent contractors, then they're more likely to be classified as employees. So we have the gig economy, right? That's complicated matters a little bit. I mean, the Uber owners typically own their own cars. Same thing with Lyft. So that would make them seem more like contractors. On the other hand, some of these rideshare companies help the employee buy the car, and they actually will help the employee finance the car. So it looks a little bit less independent, if you know what I mean. And there's been laws passed, there's been propositions passed. The general principle when you're dealing with, if you're bringing in independent contractors, is you should not be using contracting to avoid the minimum wage or like create really bad working conditions or sweatshops for people. A sweatshop is literally where people would make garments as independent contractors. And they take a big pile of cloth at home and they would, make all these clothing at home, then bring them back to the clothing company. And often they were paid very low and they're having work in very unpleasant conditions, even if it was at home. You shouldn't be doing contracting for that. What you can be doing contracting for is, for instance, if, like, for instance, you're not a design person, you're a software person, but you need someone to design a logo for you, then, you're not in the logo design business. They are, and they might have many clients that they're doing logos for. And so they would be more likely to be an independent contractor or consider that. And that's another thing. So if someone's working full-time for you, they're more likely to be an employee, but if they're working maybe for a whole bunch of different people, they're more likely to be independent contractors. Any questions on this? Because this is really so important. And you may be on the other side of this too.
I have a quick question about something like Fiverr, like these online almost outsourcing of work to be done. So if I pay somebody on Fiverr to like write code for me, is it already written into the agreements that I'm signing but not quite reading on Fiverr on who owns
Oh.
what and how they're treated?
There almost certainly is something on who owns what. And in terms of whether the independent contractor is in place, that almost as certainly is written in there. And they probably say that the people providing the services are independent contractors. However, they don't have the last word on it. So while most parts of these business contracts are enforceable, there are provisions that are contrary to public policy. That's why public policy is important. And whether someone's an independent contractor or not cannot be settled by the business-to-business contract. The IRS and the government will look to these factors. So if you are using someone for like an individual person for 40 hours or 60 hours a week, then the government might say that even if Fiverr is an intermediary, they might still be your employee and you might owe taxes on them. On the other hand, if it's a design firm and yeah, you're hiring them for 60 hours a week, but they have like 10 employees, I mean, so that you're just still a small part of their business, then using these factors, you'd be less likely to be considered your employee.
Does it go away if I'm like fixed feeing on a project and like I think it takes 10 hours, but it takes them like 60?
That's a really, really good question because you don't necessarily have control over how many hours they're working. So I had a friend who has a law firm, was created a law firm and wanted a website. This was a while ago. And my significant other did the website. It should have taken maybe 20 hours to put together the website. They're both perfectionists. She did a flat fee, $200, if you can believe it. And she probably spent like about 300 hours on it. So it's not his fault she spent so much time, although he should have known better. So you have to be careful about that. In theory, I mean, if it's a flat fee, if it seems reasonable that it could be done within an amount of hours where the person is going to be making at least minimum wage, then arguably they could be considered an independent contractor. On the other hand, if it's really obvious that they cannot complete this project in the amount of hours that would give them minimum wage, then things aren't looking so good. If it's some crazy person who puts an insane amount of time on a small project, as long as you don't know they're putting in that amount of time, I would guess one would be okay. I can't say for sure. But once you find out that they're putting crazy amounts of time in, then you'll either have to rein them in or decide to bring them on as an employee, perhaps. That's where the independence thing comes in, right? I mean, you want them to be independent contractors, but all of a sudden they could be doing things that could make things awkward for you. Okay, I'm going to jump to the next one and look at the clock too. Okay, so did I go too far? Let's see. Yeah. So related to this are intellectual property. Read your employment agreements. I said B2B contracts are for real. They get enforced. They might have language that affects the ownership of intellectual property you create, but here's the catch. If it says intellectual property agreement, you're going to know it's intellectual property agreement, but often intellectual property agreements are called something that you would not guess that they're intellectual property agreements, like non-disclosure agreement, right? They said, oh, we don't want you, disclosing our secrets. Well, that sounds reasonable that, you're going to work for someone, you shouldn't be taking all their stuff and dumping it to the public. So you sign an NDA, but then you read it closely and the NDA says, oh, by the way, if you create any patents or copyrights, we own those. And if you create stuff in the future, we own those. If you have your own independent company, but you do work for us, we may own anything that you make that's within the scope of our business. And one company I was doing work for, the scope of their business is they had a catalog business. Oh, it's not only the scope of their business now, but what their scope of the business may in the future. So they had all sorts of projects. They're expanding all sorts of areas. I didn't know what they're going to do in the future. You know what I mean? And so I felt I'd have to be crazy to sign something like that. But, it was this little hidden language in here that you've got to read through these agreements. And even if there's a 100-page agreement, you got to read through it. So in that case, what we did was so I've been able to negotiate these undesirable provisions out of these agreements. But there's a couple of things. There's a good chance you're gonna get yelled at. So I've gotten yelled at quite a bit. Like they said, no one else brings these objections up. What are you? And then maybe the project's going to be delayed. So, and like what one company was is that they had one subsidiary, like in California, that had bad provisions. And a lot of times these people can't change provisions without spending a lot of money on lawyers themselves. But they had a Maryland subsidiary that had good intellectual property terms, believe it or not. So we put the contract under the Maryland subsidiary. They didn't have to rewrite any legal contracts. They just switch subsidiaries, and they get the benefit of the work anyway. For the catalog company, after about 6 months, it took 6 months for them to realize that they weren't going to get stuff out of me, contract language out of me if they wanted, but they really needed the stuff. So we just did it without a contract, and they paid me, and there are no intellectual property provisions. You know what I mean? Some of the crazy things that happened, but business went on, and we were all happy. I mean, they didn't stiff me, I didn't stiff them on it. Okay, so and U.S. students and maybe a staff of SFSU and faculty are affected by the San Francisco State University intellectual property policy and procedures. It's this number over here, you can look it up. It's pretty faculty and student friendly. So unless you're doing work for like a sponsored contract, like the federal government, or unless someone donated a bunch of money or is getting something from San Francisco State, like for instance, Doc Martens gave SFSU Design some money, the tennis shoe company or athletic shoe company, to create different sorts of shoes for them. And so they would own the designs, and the students would be obligated to sign those designs over. At least that was the understanding. But if it's just something you're working on yourself, generally, it's not something you like stole from a professor or a federal project, it's yours, at least as far as SFSU is concerned. And that goes for faculty as well. And that's really nice because a lot of other universities have much less friendly intellectual property ownership policies. So likewise, what if you're hired by a company as an employee, but you're not an engineer or creator? Should they own all the creative works that you do? They're not paying you for that. In a lot of states, they're going to own it. But according to California Labor Code, there's provisions that protect you if your contract or if you're not hired to do this engineering sort of work, for instance. And it's limited, but it can often help and make the difference in some of these things. It's only fair. Okay, so I'm going to get into intellectual property types. Selling permits. I'm sorry, we just jumped ahead. I rearranged some of my slides at the last minute. So we've talked about some of the permits that you need, and here's where I mentioned rockets. Some businesses require federal licensing. For instance, you're going to launch rockets. The Federal Aviation Administration and maybe the Department of Commerce are going to want you to get permits from them for that sort of thing. For those who are creating purely informational websites, you generally don't need licenses for those. Okay, so let's go in the first part of intellectual property, trade secrets. If you have something like you invented a soft drink formula and no one can figure out what that formula is while you make your soft drinks, that's a trade secret. Like Coca-Cola's recipe is a trade secret. So likewise, if you have people making it for you and they learn the trade secret, you can contract with them in advance saying that they agree to keep your thing secret. Now, they might blab it anyway, and there's maybe only so much you can do, but sometimes this will help up your company if you want to keep things secret. You should try to do it anyway. And then there's laws, there's Uniform Trade Secrets Act, and trade secrets can last forever unless the secret gets out. So patents, you've all heard of patents, and intellectual property is important because if you put a lot of effort in creating creative property and technical inventions and software, you don't want someone just copying that, because if they can copy it, they can sell it for cheaper than you because it costs you money to put all this work into it, but they can sell it for, if they don't have to, then they can undercut you. And that's why these things are valuable to encourage innovation, because they give you some protection to recover your investment in like research in creative works. Okay, so what do patents, what can they cover? This is called subject matter. They protect ideas. They can protect physical products, physical machines, chemical compounds, physical implementations of computer programs, like for instance, if a computer program is operating some sort of hardware. It used to be possible to get patents on business methods, like for instance, you sell stock instead of in California, you sell stock in Nevada or something. I swear they would give you a patent on something like as mundane as that at one point in time. They've tightened that up much more now, and the Supreme Court may weigh in further. The requirements for a patent, in addition to subject matter, is that it's new, has to be novel, useful. That's pretty widely interpreted, but does have useful and non-obviousness. And this is not a misspelling, it's non-obvious, which means that for someone who works in the field, if you present them with this problem, like how do you make, like, say, a really waterproof iPhone or something, that someone who's in that field of waterproofing thinks, oh, we'll put the sealant on it, that's obvious. But if it's something that they would not have thought of, then it's, generally speaking, is non-obvious. There are three types of patents: utility, which is on useful stuff like the subject matter things we talked about; plant patents, if you're really interested, ask me about those; and design patents, which are on aesthetic shapes for things. So for instance, if you have like a water bottle like this, I don't know if you can see it. Sorry. You can't see it. Okay. Say you have a bottle has a nice shape, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't make it more slip resistant or anything. It's just a beautiful looking shape. You get, if it's new, you get a design patent on that. But if the bottle has a shape that's maybe more grip resistant, for instance, or slip resistant, then that's something you could get a utility patent on. Okay, and so patent applications. This is a big one for some of you. When to file a patent application, because it's a lot of work and is not free. So, and patent applications are valuable because, at least in the tech world, a lot of investors will expect you to have a patent application before they'll invest in your company. Now, the irony is that maybe you're never going to end up getting a patent on this, but they still want to see the patent application anyway. It gives you some bargaining power. It gives you something to sell. You can sell a patent application. The patent application doesn't give you any protection to prevent other people from making, using, or selling the patent, but it can still, if you still sell the application, because whoever owns it has a hope that they can do that someday. So here's the catch. For most of the world, nearly all of the world, you have to file your patent application before publicly disclosing or selling your invention or using it. If you're demonstrating in front of a lot of people, that would bar you from getting a patent in most of the world. The United States, you get a 1-year grace period for some of the above activities. So have to be careful, but we're a little more lenient in that. But once that year is gone, then it's history for you. So you obviously want to file a patent application if you think it's something valuable for you before you disclose it, or if it's only going to be valuable in the U.S. for you, or if the U.S. is the only thing you care. And you really should think broadly, but you'll do it within a year in the United States. But what if two parties invent the same thing? In the United States and most of the world, the party who first files the patent application on a particular invention has priority to get the patent. There's something called a provisional application, which is kind of like a temporary patent application. It itself can never turn into a patent, but it can be converted to a regular patent application. And the important thing is it's less expensive, there are less requirements on it, but it counts as if you filed your regular patent application by that date, in a sense. So you protect your ability to file a regular patent application in the United States and much of the rest of the world by first filing a provisional. The provisionals expire in 1 year themselves, and don't go to a patent attorney on the last couple of days before it expires and say, please write me a patent application. That would be a disaster. It takes longer than that to write these things typically. But at least it gives you about 11 months to test your thing out in public, see what customers think about it, see if anyone might license it, see if anyone might buy it. And after a year, you might decide no one's going to want this thing, and you can save yourself a lot of money for filing the regular patent application. The catch is that the regular patent application has to sufficiently disclose the invention. If it doesn't, then you're not going to get the benefit from it. So what counts as a public disclosure in academia, for instance? Arguably, classroom presentations, if it's just the people in the class, do not count as a public disclosure. But if you're inviting public guest speakers, they either should have to sign something saying they agree that this is a confidential presentation if they're willing to sign that. Well, anyway, you need to get them to sign it. And it can be very simple so that they don't feel like they're getting stuck in something. But what if someone in your class posts it to the social media? Then it's a public disclosure. So you have to be very careful about, what gets recorded, who has those recordings, and who's going to be at your presentation in the classroom. If you go to a technical conference and you present it, that's a public presentation. And that gets the clock ticking. Okay, so what do you have to train for patent applications? Let's see what we're doing time-wise. Okay, we've got half an hour, is that correct? Okay, so for design patents, it's mostly drawings of what your shape is. Plan patents, ask me if you're really interested, they're a particular sort of a thing. Utility for these useful inventions is you need to disclose your invention, essentially how to make and use it. So someone who knows the field should be able to read your invention, know how to make or use your invention. If they can't, then you're not adequately disclosing it and you don't get the benefit of it. They may just reject your invention. And then you're going to claim that you own a certain technology, like a certain chemical compound, a certain type of software application, a certain like piece of machinery. But you have to state exactly what it is you're claiming in your patent application. And you're going to probably try to claim something very broad. Like, for instance, I'm claiming a patent on all water bottles. So if my patent passes, anyone makes a water bottle, will have to pay me royalties, or I can shut them down. The patent office is going to say, well, water bottles have been invented already. So I'm going to say, well, okay, I have a water bottle made of this really new plastic that's super sustainable and reduces carbon. And it's this compound that no one's ever created before. And so they might approve that claim. It's a lot more specific, it's a lot more narrower. So you're going to try to make it as broad as possible. They're going to try to narrow it down most of the time. And so what are filing costs for small players? So if you do the stuff yourself, you can actually get into the patent office. Last time I checked, for under $100 US. It's kind of a super small entity. And that's a provisional. At some point, maybe earlier than later, you're going to want a patent attorney, even if you can afford it and get one, even have them write up the provisional patent application. But to be honest, attorneys, their fees range from a few to several $100s per hour. And to file a patent application with a patent attorney, doing it, if it's a simple one, it might be a few thousand. If it's a biotech one, it's probably going to be at least $50,000, maybe even more. With inflation, 100,000 more. They get even more expensive than that. The upside in biotech is huge, though, which is why they justify these. If you read the patents in some of these fields, you'll understand why they're so expensive to put together. Okay, moving on for patents and copyrights. Copyrights do not protect ideas. They protect copy and expressions of ideas. So it's the copying part that's important. If someone is on a deserted island, they're born on the island, they're the only person on the island, and they write the complete works of Harry Potter, just by coincidence, they have not copied J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. They've come up with it by themselves. They're not copying, therefore copyright does not protect J.K. Rowling against their creation. Not likely, but possible under the law. But if you write something and someone reads it and then they come up with something very similar, well, there's a pretty good chance they copied it, and you can probably prove they copied in that case, or there's a good chance you can, and you'll be protected. So what's covered? Written works like books, images, sculptures, even computer code, movies, songs, although songs have kind of a special classification of intellectual property. So here's the thing. So someone else cannot copy original computer code. They cannot literally copy your code. They cannot take a file from your library and then just start distributing it if it's copyrighted, if they don't have your permission or some sort of license. But they can take the functionality. If the functionality has not been patented, they can take the functionality from your code, rewrite it in their own language and their own code, and they don't have to pay your royalties. They don't need to get your permission. Does anyone have any questions on that? Because that's a subtle point and it's going to affect some of you. Okay. And there's something called fair use. Like you've seen movies that make fun of other movies, for instance. And There's a fair amount of fair use for things that are critical works of other works, things that parody them. But if it's a fan website, for instance, and you're a big fan of something, you're just putting up all their images because you love it, then that's not fair use typically, and you can be sued for copyright infringement. Okay, trademarks. Trademarks are kind of interesting. The goal, and these aren't under Constitution, there's had been some legal gymnastics with the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to do this. So they protect source indicators to avoid confusion by consumers. So consumers often look to something to figure out who made it. Like for instance, the famous Campbell soup, if the Campbell name and logo appears, you assume Campbell soup made it, that doesn't have botulism, that's relatively safe to consume. And so we want to protect companies. We want to give them incentive to make good products. Like for instance, if anyone could put the Campbell's name and label on a can of soup, they could put like sludge and sewage water in there and sell it for a lot cheaper, make a lot of money, and then disappear. And meanwhile, we won't know if you're getting the good soup or the bad soup, and so there'd be no incentive for like the Campbell's company to not put sludge in their soup because no one would know if it's theirs or not. So trademark is protected against that. And you have the common law. If you start using your trade name or your trademark locally, and there's no conflicting trademark, then you have common law trademark rights, and you can put a TM on that. And here's an example. For instance, there was a drive-in in Wisconsin that would sell hamburgers named McDonald's. I think this was in the 50s or early 60s. And then the McDonald's Corporation formed in the next state and got federal registration for their mark. So who gets to use the McDonald's trademark in that case? This was a real case, by the way. And I've actually seen that little McDonald's. So the McDonald's Corporation gets to use it in the entire United States of America, except for the town where the other McDonald's was using it first. Because the first McDonald's had common law rights. So they got common law in the territory where they used it before the McDonald's Corporation came on the scene. And they can't be dislodged by federal registration. On the other hand, because federal registration exists everywhere else, that covers everywhere else, they can't expand beyond that town. So they can't use the McDonald's trademark somewhere else. Could this confuse consumers? Yeah, it could, but that's the way priority works here. So no registration is required for those. However, you may have to file your business name locally. State registration is required for state trademarks. California has state trademarks. And the big one is federal registration. It's about $250 per class. You might only have one class, or if your stuff's useful all over, you might have a lot of classes. And I brought a couple of props. I don't know if these will show up or not. But for instance, can you see this? Does anyone recognize it? So what does this mean to you? At least in a product sense or a trademark sense or source indicator sense.
A generic alligator?
But what school are we going to?
San Francisco State. Gators.
No one else said it either. I guess they're not really doing their job marketing well enough. Okay, so we've got our SF Gators, you know what I mean? And then how about this hat? Anyone recognize this logo? It's a barrier, so you might not.
But the SFSU Gator.
No, it looks a little bit like it, doesn't it? In fact, it looks a lot like it.
A sports team?
This is the University of Florida Gators sports team logo. And this is actually their color. They have a blue and orange color. So there could be some room for trademark infringement, especially now that the Florida Gator is used for the product Gatorade. And so Gator on a sports drink is a product all over the world for that. But in terms of selling athletic merchandise, it muddles the situation. I don't know exactly what the situation is, but there aren't necessarily tons of University of Florida fans in San Francisco and vice versa in Gainesville, Florida. So I haven't heard of any conflict on that. But if San Francisco State started selling a sports drink, the University of Florida would probably go right after them. Okay, so we did copyrights. So domain names are not trademarks themselves, but a domain name can contain a trademark. And before you plan on using a domain name for your company, you want to make sure it's not someone else's trademark. Domain names can be registered with the appropriate authority. Your computer science people know all about that. Again, but before you plan on making your business around one of these, do a trademark search first. Make sure you avoid being close to someone else's trademark, especially on similar goods. And once you do get your domain name, remember to pay the renewal fees, because it's really easy to lose good domain names because you haven't paid renewal fees. There's people out there lurking all the time, ready to jump on domain names where the fees haven't been paid, even for relatively small, unpopular domain names. So we'll get back to that. So this is kind of accounting stuff. You might get this in other parts of the hub, books, record keeping, and taxes. I'm not going to go too much into accounting, but you should keep records of all your receipts. Maybe keep hard copies of your major financial transactions in case your computer dies. You're going to need this to manage your company, maintain your cash flow, and also to pay taxes. And taxes is a big legal thing. There's software, but you need to understand what the software is and what it does. So if you've taken accounting courses, hang on to those textbooks. Financial logistics, you may need to set up a bank account. And in California, sometimes it feels like you need a reference letter from the Pope to set up an account. A lot of banks don't just let you set up banks. At least I've had that problem. I know other people have. But you can talk to different banks, and where one bank might not let you set up an account, another bank will. Supposedly Silicon Valley Bank was a little bit easier going for startup companies, and they're gone. But you just have, anyway, you just have to talk until you find someone. PayPal can be an intermediate place where if you don't have a bank account, you can do some of your stuff over PayPal. And even once you do get it, it might be useful for certain transactions, especially if people, want people know your checking account number. A really big one, this is kind of what got Freed Bank Control. Do not intermingle personal business funds. The record keeping will be insane. Even if you're a sole proprietorship, you might get in trouble with the IRS. Some of you will do it anyway, and some of you will regret it because it's really easy to do, even unintentionally. So taxes, this is a little bit important, especially if you're a startup. You've got your social security number, but you don't necessarily want to hand out your social security number everyone. It doesn't look that professional. So you can file and request a tax identification number for the EIN. You can get for yourself as a proprietorship. If you set up a corporation, you'll probably have to get a separate one for the corporation. These aren't a big deal. They don't cost anything. And you also have to do state and federal income tax filings. If you don't, you can get in trouble with the law, which is why I'm bringing this up under a law sort of thing. Some places require county filings. And if you're a sole proprietorship, you can fill out as part of your personal income tax as a Schedule C, which will list all the types of expenses. And if you are going to do that, you should just get yourself a Schedule C so you know how to classify the expenses. It's a relatively simple scheme, but it works for a lot of businesses at the IRS. Here's a big one. If you're an independent contractor, work for someone else, you have to pay your half of Social Security tax plus the employer's half of Social Security tax. That's 15.3%. If you don't know about that until taxes are due and you made $100,000, you owe $15,000 that you didn't expect to owe to the IRS. Now, you'll get some of it back if you live long enough through Social Security, but the fact is it could be a really stiff bill if you did not expect it. And likely, if your independent contractor you hired is considered to be an employee, then you go owe a big chunk of that to the government yourself. Okay, liability and liability insurance. This is a pretty big deal. I don't want to get you too paranoid, but if you do anything, your business that even personally injures people, you might be liable for damages in other amounts. Like some of them are called punitive damages. Like they're saying, you drove your car on the sidewalk just because for the thrill of it. And yes, you could be put in jail, but you also should be punished financially for doing such a horrible thing. Likewise, if you make a product like you sell a sports drink and there's something in it that was a little bit iffy, but you put it in there because it made it taste so much better, and it turns out it's carcinogenic, then you could be sued for the health insurance and lost wages that people have had because they got cancer, and additional punitive damages because you should have known better and you did something bad that you knew you were doing that was bad. Okay, so how do you make this a little bit manageable, especially for small businesses, especially if you say you probably have renter's insurance or homeowner's insurance. You can get a rider onto that insurance policy that if some people come onto your business premises or come into your home to pick up like something, that they slip and fall, your insurance covers that. Your home owner's insurance typically does not cover business visitors, but you can maybe give them a few extra $100, say a month or a year. I don't know, a year, it depends on where you're at. And they will cover you for business visitors and certain business activities. Likewise, if you're doing computer contracting to people, you can get like liability insurance for being there. It's like, for instance, if you accidentally trip someone at their place of business, then that company would be liable to their employee got tripped and injured, and then you would be liable to that company for, you know, sticking your leg out negligently. And so that'd be one type of insurance that you can get insurance. So if you get sued for that, you're covered. But then what if you design something and there's a glitch in your software that ends up costing that company $1 billion in like lost fees or expenses? Well, you can also get liability insurance for that. That could be more expensive. That could be more iffy. You're going to have to make a personal risk assessment, how much you're willing to pay for that and whether you're willing to pay for that. And the company that you're working with may have something to say about that as well. And all that's going to get negotiated. So if there's certain types of risks, like for instance, lost profits, like for instance, if you're selling baked goods, like you have a bakery, and all of a sudden the wheat crop gets compromised and wheat prices go up. You can like buy options in the commodities market and things like that to mitigate those risks. That's more of a financial thing. And you usually don't get thrown in jail for not having profits, but you might not want to take that risk, or investors might not want to. And so you can mitigate that as well. So for each type of your business, maybe I'm going to turn off recording for this part.
We're recording again.
Great. Okay. Okay, so startup financing in the law, you can't just start selling stock to anyone. There are a whole bunch of laws, bunches of laws that govern that. Okay, maybe you can if you're like a little kid and you sell stock to your classmates and it's just for a few pennies or something. Maybe some of us have done that and we haven't gone to jail for it. But generally speaking, you can't do that in real life. There's a whole bunch of laws, and those laws can get you in big trouble if you don't follow them fairly strictly. So when you borrow money, also you want to find out what you're personally liable for, because you may borrow money as your startup financing. And they may want, and normally in bankrupt, if you go bankrupt, your house is protected, certain assets are protected. But if there's an agreement saying that they can take your house or your car, for instance, for your company, then if you go broke, you may have to give up those things to whoever you borrowed money for. But what about investors? And investors give you money. You're in a corporation, you should be protected for personal liability. The investors may make you say that even though you're a corporation, you still have to personally sign over your personal assets in case the company goes broke. And those are enforceable. So you don't, I mean, it's up to you whether to sign those or not, but you may not get the investments that you need for your business if you don't sign those. It can be a tough choice. You can give equity in exchange for services and expertise, but be very careful about that. Investors hate it when you just willy-nilly give people equity. It can kill your corporation, your venture very early if you are not super careful about that. Don't give out much equity, and make sure your equity vests over a period of years. Make sure that the equity vests after people do a certain thing. And I'm sure the Entrepreneurship Initiative will probably cover this in much greater detail down the road. But you've heard about crowdfunding, where people sell stock via crowdfunding. Sometimes those, you just sell your product. Sometimes you're just asking for donations. And sometimes you can actually sell limited amounts of stock. So they take care of the regulations. You have to follow certain rules. There are usually limits on this. But you now, because of relatively recent legislation, sell small amounts of stock to the public. Becoming a publicly traded corporation, though, where your stock is publicly traded, that's called IPO, is difficult to expensive. Not many companies can do it. Some companies use something called the SPAC route, and where they took kind of defunct but alive public companies and then use them to reissue stock around some products. A lot of people in the last few years have lost a lot of money investing in SPACs. So what can I say about those? Don't put a lot, if you can't afford to lose money, don't invest it. So I'll just say that. So the final part is, how are you going to get out of your company? Or what each party is going to probably leave the company sooner or later, even if it's through death, for instance, for maybe the CEO wants to stand forever. The founders, a lot of times they'll want to move on to the next venture, or they might just be interested for a couple of years, but they don't necessarily want to live on ramen noodles for the next 10 years. So they may leave. Your investors may have certain expectations. They may only want to invest their money for a certain amount of time. Particularly venture capitalists, VCs, have windows where they get money from their investors, and they usually have to give back all the money from the fund, including the profits, in say like a certain amount of years. You'd like it to be longer, but it's often not that long. And you need to be aware of when they have to essentially take the money back from you or sell your company off and give it, because if you're not aware of that, you may feel like you're having a lot of momentum in your company and they may shut you down or sell you off relatively cheap because they need the money to give back. Okay, basic trademark section. We have a little bit of time. Actually, we don't have that much time for this. So I wanted to emphasize, before you create your domain name, before you create your business, even if you're a super early stage business, you should probably start to be thinking names. You should do searches on these. And if you have recordings, in fact, if you take a screenshot of this, each one of you, you'll have it right now. That should be relatively easy to do. Maybe I can put it in the chat. Hang on. I can go try to put it in the chat. Where are we here? Yeah, toward the end anyway. We're almost done. And you should go to each one of these sources and check out your trade name. Let's see, where are we here? Let's go back to slideshow. Okay, so these are the places that you go to. Literally just go through each one, put in your search term. Some might be a little bit tricky, but several tries should get it right for you, and see if anyone else is using your name. Ideally, you should be searching each city and each county in the entire world where you're doing your business. That's not realistic. So at least search your first few big markets where you get your initial customers, and definitely search the USPTO tests, for instance. Okay, so wrap up, some reminders. Always read your business's business contracts before you sign them. They're enforceable. There's all sorts of things that may really screw up your business if you don't know about them. And even if you know about them, they might, but at least you know what you're getting into. Do prep working, such as trademark searching for business and product names. So it's not just your business, but your product names as well. And then think ahead. Where do you want you and your business to be in 2, 5, 10, or more years? How will you leave it, and what form do you wish to leave it? For instance, as a family business, you might want to leave it to your kids, and you might want to put it in a certain form. So that's going to be estate planning that you'll want to do. If it's a corporation, and you don't think it's going to be big enough for an IPO, but you think in 10 years you'll be done with it, you'll want to start organizing it, packaging it, so that you can sell it to some other company if that's what you want to do. And a lot of times that's how startups kind of end their lives. They get transformed into bigger businesses through acquisitions. And are there any last questions? Okay, so I think we've ended on time. So this will be a recording. Where should we put the recording? I don't know if there's anything like set up for that.
The recording will be made available on the INE website in the webinar and workshop archives.
Okay. And I will be posting office hours soon. And if you have any questions that are a little more private, or you want to go into more detail, please, I encourage you to sign up for those.
Great. Okay. I'm gonna put another initiative into the chat real quick. If you are interested in starting up your own business, we have a micro entrepreneurship boot camp coming up. It's free for the San Francisco State community. It's 2 days, and it goes over a little bit of everything, a little bit of legal, a little bit of setting up your own website, web hosting, and web store, if that's the direction you want to go in, a little bit on marketing, search engine optimization, a little bit of financing and budgeting in there also. So free to sign up, and it's 2 days.
I have a question about that. So
Yeah.
do you need to have a like actual business idea and initiative, or can you go there just to like learn how things would happen?
You can go just to learn. It's a lot of it's very workshopy where you're actually in there kind of setting up your website.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. But it definitely open for people who just kind of want to hear how the process works also. And you can jump through
Yes.
the hoops with a fictitious idea also.
Okay. Sounds good.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Very much appreciate your time and knowledge base. Yeah. Any last questions?
Oh, thank
I
you.
hope to see,
All
I
good.
hope to see you around the hub sometime. It looks like it's a really great space. Looks like there could be a lot of creativity going on there. And you're so lucky. This didn't even exist a few years ago. It's a great time to be at SF State.
Yeah, it's swing by Humanities 125. It's the innovation hub. It's a co-working space, co-working and networking space, and soon to be maker space also. So come on by.
Thank you.
Thank you.